The war did not start an economic crisis in the United States. It interrupted one that was already unfolding. Before the first missile crossed a border, the American economy was overheating. Debt was accelerating. Inflation was eroding purchasing power. And markets were held together by intervention rather than strength. Growth looked real, but it was fragile. Stability looked solid, but it was conditional. Then the war began, and suddenly, money moved. Energy flowed differently. Capital chose sides. What appeared to the public as foreign aid and geopolitical necessity functioned, inside the system, as stimulus, stabilization, and strategic advantage. This is not a story about morality or politics. It is a story about incentives. Because while much of the world absorbed shock, the United States absorbed capital. And in modern economics, capital decides who bleeds and who consolidates. Before the first shots were fired in Ukraine, the economic position of the United States was far more fragile than the headlines suggested. On the surface, the country appeared to be recovering from the pandemic shock faster than most of the developed world. Equity markets were hovering near record highs, unemployment was falling, and official growth figures painted a picture of resilience. Yet beneath this polished narrative, the American economy was entering a dangerous transitional phase, where structural weaknesses were quietly accumulating and policy options were narrowing. The pandemic response had fundamentally altered the balance of the U.S. economic model. Trillions of dollars had been injected into the system through stimulus checks, emergency lending programs, and unprecedented fiscal expansion. For a brief moment, this liquidity created the illusion of prosperity. Consumer spending surged, asset prices exploded, and corporate profits rebounded with remarkable speed. However, this growth was not organic. It was debt-driven, policy-manufactured, and heavily dependent on continued intervention from the state and the central bank. Inflation was the first visible crack in the facade. By the time global attention shifted toward Eastern Europe, price pressures in the United States were already accelerating at levels not seen in decades. Official consumer price indices began climbing month after month, eroding purchasing power across income groups. Food, housing, energy, and transportation costs rose faster than wages, turning nominal pay increases into statistical illusions rather than real improvements in living standards. For households, the recovery felt thinner than the charts suggested. At the same time, the labor market was sending mixed signals. Employment numbers improved, yet labor force participation failed to fully recover. Millions of workers had exited the workforce altogether, while job openings soared in lower productivity sectors. This imbalance masked deeper inefficiencies. Businesses faced rising costs and shrinking margins, while productivity growth remained weak. The economy was expanding, but it was doing so on unstable foundations. Financial markets, meanwhile, became increasingly detached from the real economy. Stock valuations reached levels historically associated with speculative excess rather than sustainable growth. Price-to-earnings ratios expanded far beyond long-term averages, fueled by cheap money rather than rising productivity or innovation. Investors were no longer pricing risk accurately. They were pricing central bank support. The implicit assumption was that policymakers would always intervene to prevent meaningful declines, regardless of the underlying economic reality. This dependency created critical vulnerability. With inflation accelerating, the Federal Reserve faced an impossible dilemma. Tightening monetary policy risked triggering a recession and destabilizing financial markets that had grown addicted to low interest rates. Maintaining loose policy, however, risked entrenching inflation and undermining confidence in the dollar. The era of painless stimulus was coming to an end, and the margin for error was shrinking rapidly. Public debt added another layer of fragility. Federal borrowing had surged to historic levels, pushing the debt burden to heights previously associated with wartime economies. Servicing this debt remained manageable only because interest rates were artificially suppressed. Any sustained rise in yields threatened to turn debt servicing into a dominant budgetary expense, crowding out other spending and constraining fiscal flexibility. The United States was no longer merely managing debt. It was structurally dependent on cheap financing. Globally, the context was equally unfavorable. Supply chains were still disrupted, geopolitical tensions were rising, and globalization itself was entering a phase of retrenchment. The assumption that goods, capital, and energy would flow freely across borders was no longer guaranteed. This shift posed particular risks to an economy deeply integrated into global financial and trade networks. Stability abroad was no longer a given, yet the American system was built on that very assumption. By early 2022, the United States stood at a crossroads. Growth was slowing, inflation was accelerating, financial markets were overstretched, and policy tools were constrained. The economic engine was still running, but it was overheating and running on borrowed fuel. What the system lacked was a mechanism to rebalance itself without triggering a painful adjustment. Historically, moments like this force economies to confront their imbalances through recessions, market corrections, or structural reform. None of these options were politically attractive. A recession threatened public confidence and electoral stability. Market corrections risked exposing the fragility of the financial system. Structural reform required long-term sacrifices in a political environment focused on short-term outcomes. It was in this context of latent instability that the war in Ukraine began. The conflict did not create America's economic problems, but it arrived at a moment when the system was uniquely vulnerable and searching for an external catalyst. The United States entered the war not from a position of strength, but from a position of unresolved tension, where growth depended on constant intervention and stability depended on global conditions that were rapidly deteriorating. Understanding this pre-war economic landscape is essential. Without it, the subsequent shifts in capital flows, energy markets, defense spending, and currency dynamics appear accidental or purely political. In reality, they interacted with an economy already under strain, reshaping incentives and outcomes in ways that would soon redefine the trajectory of American growth. When the war in Ukraine began, its immediate economic impact on the United States was not visible in consumer prices or employment reports. It appeared first in budget reallocations, emergency packages, and defense authorizations that quietly transformed geopolitical conflict into domestic economic momentum. What followed was not accidental stimulus, but a familiar historical pattern. War functioning as an external demand engine for a system that had already exhausted traditional tools of growth. From the earliest weeks of the conflict, federal spending priorities shifted with remarkable speed. Congress approved large-scale military and financial assistance packages, framed publicly as strategic necessity and moral obligation. Economically, however, these packages acted as direct injections into specific sectors of the American economy, bypassing the inefficiencies of broad consumer stimulus. Defense contractors, logistics firms, technology suppliers, and energy producers became the primary transmission channels through which war-related spending entered the domestic system. Unlike social programs, military expenditures carry a unique multiplier effect. They generate demand without immediately raising household consumption expectations, and they concentrate capital in industries with long supply chains and high capital intensity. Every weapons contract triggered secondary demand for metals, electronics, software, transportation, and skilled labor. This cascade effect stabilized industrial activity at a moment when private investment was slowing and monetary tightening was beginning to restrict credit. The defense sector, long criticized for inefficiency, suddenly became one of the most reliable engines of predictable revenue growth. Long-term procurement contracts insulated firms from market volatility and rising interest rates. Revenues were secured not by consumer confidence, but by government guarantees. For investors, this represented a rare form of certainty in an increasingly unstable macroeconomic environment. Capital flowed accordingly. Financial markets responded almost immediately. Shares of major defense manufacturers outperformed broader indices, even as technology and consumer discretionary stocks began to weaken under inflationary pressure. This divergence signaled a deeper shift in how investors perceived risk. War-related industries were no longer viewed as cyclical or politically sensitive. They were reclassified as defensive assets, similar to utilities or treasury bonds, but with higher growth potential. At the same time, the war altered the structure of federal deficits. Unlike pandemic-era stimulus, which was explicitly temporary and socially oriented, defense spending carried an implicit assumption of duration. Once supply chains were mobilized and production scaled, reversing course became politically and strategically costly. This locked a portion of government spending into a semi-permanent expansion path, effectively anchoring demand regardless of broader economic conditions. This shift had important implications for inflation dynamics. While consumer prices continued to rise, war-related spending redistributed inflationary pressure rather than eliminating it. Input costs increased across industrial sectors, but these costs were absorbed by government contracts rather than passed directly to consumers. In effect, inflation was partially nationalized. The state assumed the role of buyer of last resort, smoothing price volatility while increasing its own fiscal exposure. Internationally, the war accelerated capital realignment in favor of the United States. As uncertainty spread across Europe, Institutional investors sought stability, liquidity, and political insulation. American assets, particularly those tied to defense and energy, benefited disproportionately. This capital inflow strengthened domestic financial conditions, even as global risk aversion increased. Paradoxically, global instability reduced financing pressure on the U.S. economy. Currency markets reflected this dynamic clearly. Demand for dollar-denominated assets increased as investors hedged against geopolitical risk. This reinforced the dollar's role not merely as a reserve currency, but as a crisis instrument. A stronger dollar reduced import costs and helped moderate domestic inflation, further insulating the U.S. economy from external shocks. At the same time, it shifted inflationary pressure outward, particularly onto emerging markets and energy-dependent economies. Energy markets provided another critical channel through which war functioned as stimulus. Disruptions to traditional supply routes reshaped global pricing structures, creating arbitrage opportunities for American producers. Liquefied natural gas exports surged as European buyers sought alternatives, and long-term supply agreements locked in demand far beyond the immediate crisis. These contracts represented future revenue streams that could be leveraged for investment and expansion, reinforcing domestic industrial growth. Crucially, this form of stimulus did not rely on consumer optimism. It operated independently of household sentiment, credit availability, or wage growth. Demand was generated through strategic necessity rather than discretionary spending. In a macroeconomic environment defined by tightening financial conditions, this distinction mattered. War spending sustained activity precisely where traditional stimulus would have failed. Yet this transformation also introduced a subtle dependency. Growth increasingly became linked to external conflict rather than internal productivity gains. Investment decisions shifted towards sectors aligned with geopolitical tension, while long-term structural reforms were deferred once again. The economy stabilized, but it did so by embedding crisis into its growth model. By the end of the first year of the conflict, it was clear that the war had not merely influenced the American economy, it had reoriented it. What appeared publicly as foreign aid functioned domestically as targeted stimulus, industrial policy, and financial stabilization mechanism. The consequences of this shift would not be immediately visible in headline growth figures, but they would shape the incentives, risks, and vulnerabilities of the system for years to come. As the initial surge of war-related spending settled into the broader economic system, its secondary effects became increasingly visible in areas that rarely feature in official narratives. Beyond defense contracts and energy exports, the conflict reshaped the internal mechanics of capital allocation, labor demand, and policy coordination within the United States, revealing how deeply modern growth had become intertwined with geopolitical tension. One of the most underappreciated shifts occurred in corporate financing behavior. Firms operating in war-adjacent sectors gained privileged access to credit, not necessarily through lower interest rates, but through perceived political and strategic importance. Banks, pension funds, and institutional investors adjusted risk models to reflect implicit state backing. This reduced the effective cost of capital for selected industries at a time when the broader economy was facing tightening financial conditions. Capital scarcity became selective rather than universal. This selectivity altered the competitive landscape. Smaller firms outside defense, energy, and logistics struggled with rising borrowing costs and weaker demand, while firms embedded in government supply chains expanded capacity with relative ease. Market signals that would normally encourage efficiency and reallocation were distorted. Profitability increasingly reflected proximity to policy priorities rather than productivity or innovation. Over time, this created a two-speed economy operating under a single set of macroeconomic statistics. Labor markets responded accordingly. Skilled labor flowed towards sectors offering long-term contracts and wage stability funded by federal spending. Engineers, technicians, cybersecurity specialists, and logistics professionals migrated toward defense-related industries, draining talent from civilian manufacturing and technology firms already under pressure from rising costs. Wage inflation became uneven, concentrated in strategically favored segments, while real wages stagnated or declined elsewhere. The appearance of a strong labor market concealed growing internal imbalances. At the policy level, coordination between fiscal authorities and the Federal Reserve entered a new phase. Officially, monetary tightening proceeded to combat inflation, but in practice, fiscal expansion through war-related spending offset much of the contractionary effect. This quiet counterbalance allowed policymakers to claim discipline while maintaining growth. Inflation slowed, not because demand disappeared, but because demand was redirected into channels less visible to consumer price indices. This redirection had long-term consequences for inflation expectations. Households experienced persistent cost pressures in housing, healthcare, and food, while policymakers pointed to improving headline numbers as evidence of success. The disconnect eroded trust. Inflation was no longer perceived as a temporary shock, but as a structural feature of the post-pandemic, post-war economy. Expectations adjusted accordingly, complicating future policy decisions. On the international stage, the war reinforced the centrality of American financial infrastructure. Sanctions regimes, payment systems, and trade controls elevated the role of US-based intermediaries. Compliance, clearing, insurance, and financing increasingly passed through American institutions, generating fee income and reinforcing network effects. This financialization of geopolitics created revenue streams detached from domestic consumption, further insulating the economy from internal weakness. However, this insulation came at a cost. By externalizing instability and importing capital, the United States delayed the adjustment process that weaker economies were forced to undergo. Structural inefficiencies accumulated rather than being resolved. Productivity growth remained modest, infrastructure investment lagged strategic spending, and social cohesion weakened as inequality widened. The economy functioned, but it did not heal. Financial markets internalized these contradictions. Volatility declined even as fundamental risks increased. Investors learned that geopolitical instability often triggered supportive policy responses rather than systemic collapse. This expectation reduced perceived downside risk, encouraging leverage and speculative positioning. Stability became performative, maintained through intervention rather than balance. The system grew calmer on the surface and more fragile underneath. By this stage, the war had evolved from a catalyst into a pillar. Budget forecasts, corporate strategies, and investor expectations implicitly assumed prolonged geopolitical tension. Peace, paradoxically, began to represent economic uncertainty rather than relief. A sudden resolution would have disrupted demand patterns, exposed overcapacity, and forced a reckoning with unresolved domestic weaknesses. Stability now depended on the continuation of instability elsewhere. This inversion marked a critical transformation. War no longer merely influenced the American economy. It became integrated into its operating logic. Growth was sustained through strategic spending, capital inflows driven by fear, and a financial system optimized for crisis management rather than equilibrium. The immediate benefits were measurable and politically defensible. The long-term costs were deferred, diffuse, and increasingly difficult to quantify. By the time these dynamics were fully visible, the narrative had already hardened. The economy appeared resilient. Markets appeared confident. Policy appeared effective. Yet beneath this surface, the foundations were shifting. The second chapter of this story is not about victory or exploitation. It is about dependency. An economy that learns to grow through conflict eventually forgets how to grow without it. The war reshaped global energy flows faster than any policy reform or market transition of the previous decades. What had been discussed for years as a gradual diversification of supply became, almost overnight, an enforced realignment. For the United States, this shock did not arrive as a crisis. It arrived as an opportunity, one rooted in timing, infrastructure readiness, and financial positioning that few other economies possessed. Before the conflict, the global energy system rested on a fragile equilibrium. Europe depended heavily on pipeline gas from Russia, secured through long-term contracts that prioritized price stability over flexibility. The United States, meanwhile, had spent years quietly expanding its liquefied natural gas capacity, largely as a result of the shale revolution. This expansion was often criticized domestically as overinvestment, environmentally questionable, and geopolitically unnecessary. In retrospect, it became one of the most consequential strategic advantages of the decade. When the war disrupted established supply routes, energy markets reacted with immediate violence. Prices surged, volatility exploded, and governments scrambled to secure alternatives. In Europe, energy shifted from being an input cost to a national security concern. For American producers, the same shock translated into pricing power, guaranteed demand, and long-term contracts signed under conditions of urgency rather than negotiation. What had been a competitive export market transformed into a seller's market almost overnight. Liquefied natural gas exports from the United States accelerated at a pace that would have seemed unrealistic only months earlier. Export terminals operated at near full capacity, and new projects that had struggled to secure financing were suddenly backed by European utilities and governments, eager to lock in supply for years ahead. These agreements were not short-term emergency measures. Many extended deep into the future, effectively anchoring American energy producers to European demand well beyond the immediate conflict. This shift had profound macroeconomic implications. Energy exports became a stabilizing force for the U.S. trade balance at a moment when other sectors faced headwinds from inflation and slowing global growth. Revenues flowed in dollars, strengthening the external position of the American economy while simultaneously exporting inflationary pressure abroad. Higher energy prices burdened European consumers and manufacturers, while American firms captured margins amplified by scarcity and urgency. The industrial consequences were equally significant. Energy-intensive industries in Europe faced soaring costs, reduced competitiveness, and in some cases, outright shutdowns. Chemical producers, metal smelters, and heavy manufacturers struggled to remain viable under sustained price pressure. In contrast, American industry benefited from relatively lower domestic energy prices, supported by abundant supply and government policies designed to shield internal markets from full global pricing exposure. This asymmetry quietly reshaped the competitive balance between regions. Capital followed energy. Investment flowed into American energy infrastructure, shipping, storage, and associated financial services. Insurance markets, commodity traders, and logistics firms expanded operations tied directly to transatlantic energy flows. These activities generated high-value service income that rarely appears in headline trade statistics, but contributes meaningfully to financial sector profitability and employment. The energy realignment was not merely physical, it was deeply financial. Policy played a critical role in consolidating these gains. While publicly emphasizing alliance solidarity and energy security, American authorities supported export expansion through regulatory approvals, diplomatic engagement, and strategic messaging. Environmental concerns, previously central to domestic debates, were temporarily subordinated to geopolitical necessity. The result was a rare alignment between state interests and corporate profitability, reinforcing the durability of the new energy order. Currency dynamics amplified the effect. Energy contracts, denominated in dollars, reinforced global demand for the U.S. currency at a time of heightened uncertainty. As European buyers scrambled to secure supply, they simultaneously increased exposure to dollar liquidity, further strengthening the dollar's international position. This feedback loop reduced financing costs for the United States while raising them for energy importing economies, deepening the divergence created by the energy shock. The narrative presented to the public focused on resilience and adaptation. In economic terms, however, what occurred was a transfer of structural advantage. The United States did not simply replace a supplier. It redefined the terms under which energy security would be priced, financed, and governed. Flexibility, once considered a premium feature, became the baseline requirement, and flexibility favored those who already possessed capital, infrastructure, and financial depth. This transformation also altered long-term expectations. Energy markets began to price in geopolitical risk as a permanent feature rather than a temporary disruption. Volatility premiums increased, favoring producers with scale and diversification. Smaller exporters struggled to compete, while American firms consolidated their position through mergers, acquisitions, and capacity expansion. The war accelerated an already ongoing concentration of market power, with lasting implications for global competition. Yet beneath these gains lay a quieter shift. By anchoring growth to energy exports under conditions of geopolitical stress, the American economy further entwined its fortunes with global instability. Revenue streams depended not merely on demand, but on the persistence of uncertainty. Energy security for others became economic security for the United States. This alignment delivered measurable benefits in the short and medium term, but it also embedded risk into the structure of growth itself. By the time markets adjusted to the new equilibrium, the transformation was already institutionalized. Infrastructure investments, long-term contracts, and policy commitments locked in patterns that would outlast the immediate crisis. The energy shock had evolved into an energy regime, and in that regime, the United States occupied a central position, not as a neutral supplier, but as a strategic gatekeeper, in a world where energy had once again become a weapon as much as a commodity. As the new energy regime solidified, its second-order effects began to surface far beyond gas terminals and commodity charts. What initially appeared as a supply response evolved into a structural transformation of economic incentives, industrial geography, and political leverage. The energy shock did not simply redistribute revenues. It redefined power relations inside the global economy, with consequences that extended well past fuel markets. For Europe, energy dependence became an economic constraint rather than a logistical challenge. Governments faced a dilemma with no clean solution. Shielding households and industry from soaring prices required massive fiscal intervention, yet allowing prices to pass through risked deindustrialization and social instability. Subsidies expanded rapidly, distorting public budgets already strained by pandemic spending. Energy, once a predictable cost, turned into a fiscal liability embedded in state balance sheets. This pressure accelerated a trend that had been quietly developing for years: the erosion of Europe's industrial competitiveness. Manufacturing sectors that relied on stable and affordable energy lost ground to producers operating in regions with structural cost advantages. Investment decisions began to reflect this new reality. Capital that might once have expanded capacity within Europe increasingly flowed toward jurisdictions offering cheaper energy, lighter regulation, and policy certainty. The result was not an immediate collapse, but a gradual hollowing out of industrial depth. For the United States, the mirror image emerged. Energy abundance reinforced the attractiveness of domestic production, at a moment when supply chain resilience had become a strategic priority. Companies reconsidered offshore manufacturing not only through the lens of labor costs, but through energy security and geopolitical risk. This recalibration supported domestic investment narratives and justified selective reindustrialization, even as overall productivity gains remained modest. Energy firms, meanwhile, transitioned from cyclical players to strategic actors. Their revenues were no longer tied purely to market fluctuations, but to geopolitical alignment and policy continuity. Long-term contracts insulated them from price volatility while guaranteeing demand under conditions of uncertainty. Shareholder expectations adjusted accordingly. Valuations reflected not just earnings, but strategic indispensability. Energy assets became quasi-sovereign in nature, blending commercial logic with national interest. This transformation reshaped financial markets in subtle but persistent ways. Energy-linked cash flows were increasingly treated as defensive income streams, comparable to infrastructure or regulated utilities. Pension funds and institutional investors reweighted portfolios to include greater exposure to energy, transport, storage, and distribution networks. These assets offered inflation protection, geopolitical relevance, and implicit political backing. Risk was reframed rather than reduced. At the same time, the pricing of energy began to embed a permanent geopolitical premium. Markets no longer assumed reversion to pre-crisis norms. Instead, volatility and fragmentation were treated as baseline conditions. This shift favored actors capable of absorbing shocks and managing complexity. Scale, access to capital, and regulatory influence became decisive advantages. Smaller players and import-dependent economies faced structurally higher costs and narrower margins. The environmental dimension added another layer of complexity. Climate commitments, once framed as long-term transitions, collided with immediate security needs. In practice, this led to selective pragmatism. Emissions targets were adjusted, timelines extended, and fossil fuel investments rebranded as transitional necessities. The result was not a reversal of energy transition goals, but their partial subordination to strategic priorities. Energy security trumped environmental coherence. For the dollar system, the energy realignment provided additional reinforcement. Transactions tied to energy flows deepened dollar usage at a time when alternatives were being discussed but not operationalized. This reinforced the financial infrastructure supporting American influence, from clearing systems to insurance markets. Energy trade became another vector through which global dependence on dollar liquidity was sustained. Yet this concentration of advantage carried latent risks. By linking growth to energy exports under conditions of global stress, the American economy further aligned its fortunes with instability abroad. The persistence of elevated prices and geopolitical tension became economically convenient, even if politically undesirable. Over time, this created a subtle conflict between systemic stability and national advantage. Domestically, the benefits were unevenly distributed. Regions tied to energy production and export infrastructure prospered, while energy-consuming sectors and households faced higher costs. Inflation dynamics became increasingly bifurcated, with gains concentrated upstream and burdens spread downstream. This imbalance reinforced existing inequalities and complicated the narrative of broad-based growth. Internationally, the energy shock accelerated fragmentation. Trust and shared frameworks weakened as countries prioritized unilateral security over multilateral efficiency. Energy alliances replaced open markets, and long-term contracts substituted for spot-based competition. The global energy system became less flexible, less transparent, and more politicized. By the time these patterns became evident, they were already embedded in contracts, infrastructure, and policy commitments. Reversing them would require not only peace, but a deliberate dismantling of incentives built around scarcity and risk. That prospect appeared increasingly remote. The energy chapter of the war thus extended far beyond fuel supply. It restructured economic hierarchies, redefined competitiveness, and reinforced a model in which advantage flowed to those positioned at the intersection of capital, infrastructure, and geopolitical leverage. For the United States, this delivered tangible gains. For the global system, it marked another step away from equilibrium and toward a world where energy, once again, functioned less as a commodity and more as an instrument of power. The financial dimension of the war revealed itself not through explosions or sanctions announcements, but through capital flows, balance sheets, and currency markets reacting with almost mechanical precision. As uncertainty spread across global markets, money did what it has always done in moments of stress. It moved towards safety, liquidity, and institutional depth. In the modern system, that combination still points overwhelmingly toward the United States and its financial architecture. From the earliest days of the conflict, global investors began reassessing risk not by sector, but by jurisdiction. Europe faced proximity, energy exposure, and political fragmentation. Emerging markets faced currency pressure, capital flight, and higher borrowing costs. In contrast, the United States offered scale, legal predictability, deep markets, and a currency embedded at the core of global finance. The result was not subtle. Capital flowed into American assets with renewed intensity, reinforcing trends that had been developing since the pandemic, but had not yet fully matured. This movement manifested first in the bond market. Demand for U.S. Treasury securities increased despite rising inflation and the prospect of monetary tightening. Under normal conditions, such a combination would have driven yields sharply higher. Instead, global demand absorbed much of the issuance, allowing the federal government to finance expanding deficits without triggering immediate market stress. In effect, geopolitical instability abroad subsidized fiscal flexibility at home. For policymakers, this dynamic created strategic breathing room. The Federal Reserve could pursue rate hikes to address inflation without provoking the kind of disorderly capital flight that smaller economies often experience under similar conditions. While borrowing costs rose, they did so within a framework of sustained foreign demand for dollar-denominated assets. The tightening cycle, though aggressive by recent standards, remained manageable, precisely because global instability increased the relative attractiveness of U.S. financial instruments. Currency markets amplified this advantage. The dollar strengthened not only against emerging market currencies, but also against major developed counterparts. This appreciation reflected more than interest rate differentials. It reflected trust. In moments of systemic stress, the dollar functions less as a national currency and more as global financial infrastructure. Trade, debt servicing, commodity pricing, and reserve management remain deeply dependent on dollar liquidity. War heightened this dependency rather than diminishing it. A stronger dollar produced mixed domestic effects. On one hand, it reduced import costs and helped moderate certain inflationary pressures, particularly for goods traded internationally. On the other hand, it weighed on exports and corporate earnings abroad. Yet, at the macro level, the net effect favored financial stability. Lower imported inflation allowed tighter monetary policy without immediate collapse in consumer demand, reinforcing the perception of control and competence. The reinforcement of dollar dominance also reshaped global liquidity conditions. As capital flowed into U.S. assets, it flowed out of other systems. Emerging economies faced depreciating currencies, rising debt servicing costs, and reduced access to external financing. Central banks abroad were forced to tighten policy defensively, even as growth slowed. This divergence further strengthened the relative position of the United States, whose economy could rely on external demand for its financial assets to cushion internal adjustment. Sanctions regimes added another layer to this dynamic. Financial restrictions imposed on adversarial states signaled the extent to which access to the dollar system could be weaponized. For allies and neutral parties alike, this served as a reminder that participation in global finance remains conditional on alignment with U.S.-led institutions. While this realization sparked discussions about diversification and alternatives, in the short term, it reinforced compliance and dependence. The cost of exclusion was simply too high. Banks and financial intermediaries benefited accordingly. Increased cross-border flows, compliance requirements, hedging activity, and risk management services generated fee income and expanded balance sheets. New layers of financial complexity emerged around sanctions enforcement, energy trade financing, and geopolitical risk insurance. These activities did not show up in traditional growth statistics, but they contributed meaningfully to the profitability and centrality of the American financial sector. At the same time, equity markets internalized the logic of dollar-centric stability. Volatility spiked briefly during moments of escalation, but quickly subsided as investors recognized the pattern. Geopolitical shocks tended to strengthen, not weaken, the U.S. financial system. This expectation altered risk perception. Assets once considered vulnerable to global turmoil were reclassified as beneficiaries of it. Stability became less about the absence of shocks and more about the capacity to absorb them. This perception, however, masked an important asymmetry. While capital inflows stabilized markets, they also inflated asset prices and reinforced wealth concentration. Gains accrued primarily to holders of financial assets, while households faced persistent cost pressures. The dollar's strength benefited balance sheets more than paychecks. Financial resilience did not translate into broad-based economic comfort. Globally, resentment and concern grew alongside dependence. Countries recognized the vulnerability inherent in a system where monetary sovereignty was constrained by dollar liquidity conditions. Yet efforts to build alternatives faced coordination problems, credibility gaps, and time constraints. In the near term, fragmentation increased vulnerability rather than reducing it. The paradox of the war was that it accelerated both dissatisfaction with the dollar system and reliance upon it. By the end of this phase, the contours of a new financial order were visible, though not yet fully defined. The war had reinforced the dollar's central role, strengthened U.S. borrowing capacity, and deepened the integration of global finance into American institutions. This was not the result of deliberate design alone, but of structural positioning that favored the United States in moments of crisis. What appeared externally as chaos functioned internally as consolidation. Financial gravity intensified. Capital clustered where risk could be absorbed rather than eliminated. And once again, instability abroad translated into leverage at the center of the system. The implications of this shift would extend far beyond the immediate conflict, shaping how future crises would be financed, managed, and ultimately distributed across the global economy. As these financial dynamics matured, their deeper structural consequences became harder to ignore. What began as a defensive movement of capital gradually transformed into a reconfiguration of incentives that reshaped policy behavior, market psychology, and the long-term trajectory of the global financial system. The war did not merely strengthen the dollar, it altered how risk itself was understood and priced. One of the most profound shifts occurred in sovereign behavior. Governments around the world recalibrated their reserve strategies in response to heightened volatility. While public discourse increasingly emphasized diversification and monetary sovereignty, actual reserve allocations told a more conservative story. In practice, uncertainty reinforced preference for liquidity over ideology. Dollar-denominated assets remained the primary anchor, not because they were perfect, but because no alternative offered comparable depth, scale, and institutional trust. Crisis narrowed choice rather than expanding it. This reality granted the United States an extraordinary privilege. Fiscal deficits that would destabilize other economies became sustainable under conditions of persistent global demand for safe assets. The cost of borrowing rose in nominal terms, but remained manageable relative to historical norms and relative to peers. Debt sustainability became less a function of domestic discipline and more a function of global instability. The worse conditions became elsewhere, the more room Washington gained at home. For monetary policy, this environment produced a subtle but critical distortion. The Federal Reserve formally operated under a mandate focused on inflation and employment, yet its effective operating space was expanded by external demand for dollars. Rate hikes that might have triggered financial crises in other contexts were absorbed by global capital inflows. This asymmetry allowed tightening to proceed further and faster than would otherwise have been politically or economically feasible. However, this insulation came with hidden costs. Financial conditions within the United States tightened unevenly. Asset markets adjusted with relative calm, while credit-sensitive households and small businesses faced rising borrowing costs. Mortgage rates increased sharply, affordability deteriorated, and consumer credit became more expensive. The benefits of global confidence accrued to balance sheets and institutions, while the adjustment burden fell disproportionately on individuals. Financial markets internalized this divergence. Equity valuations stabilized not because fundamentals improved, but because the perceived backstop remained intact. Investors learned that global stress often resulted in policy accommodation rather than systemic breakdown. This expectation compressed risk premiums and encouraged leverage. Over time, this behavior increased fragility, even as surface level volatility declined. Stability was purchased at the cost of resilience. Internationally, the consequences were more severe. Capital outflows forced emerging economies into defensive postures. Interest rates were raised not to cool overheating economies, but to defend currencies and prevent balance of payments crises. Growth slowed, social pressures intensified, and fiscal space contracted. The global adjustment process became asymmetric, with weaker economies absorbing shocks that stronger ones deflected. This asymmetry fed political tension. Calls for reform of the international financial system grew louder, particularly among countries bearing the costs of dollar strength without sharing its benefits. Yet practical alternatives remained limited. Building parallel systems required trust, coordination, and time, all of which were scarce under conditions of crisis. Fragmentation increased complexity without delivering autonomy. Within the United States, the reinforcement of financial centrality influenced policy priorities. Structural reforms that might have addressed productivity, inequality, or infrastructure gaps were once again deferred. External demand for financial assets reduced urgency. The system functioned well enough to avoid immediate reckoning. Political incentives favored maintenance over transformation. This dynamic extended into corporate behavior. Firms optimized strategies around financial engineering rather than productive investment. Share buybacks, mergers, and balance sheet optimization took precedence over capacity expansion. Cheap access to capital persisted for large players, even as smaller firms struggled. Market concentration increased, reinforcing inequality across sectors and regions. Over time, the gap between financial performance and lived economic reality widened. Asset owners experienced recovery and growth, while wage earners faced persistent cost pressures. Inflation moderated in headline terms, but structural affordability issues remained unresolved. The perception of economic strength increasingly diverged from household experience, eroding trust in institutions and official narratives. Globally, the financial system emerged from this phase more centralized, more politicized, and more sensitive to geopolitical shocks. The dollar's role was not weakened by the war, it was reinforced through necessity. Yet this reinforcement came at the expense of balance. Dependence deepened even as dissatisfaction grew. By the end of this chapter, a paradox stood clearly in view. The war strengthened the financial position of the United States, while simultaneously increasing systemic fragility. Stability became conditional on continued turbulence elsewhere. The system learned to function under stress rather than resolve it. This was not a temporary anomaly. It was a structural shift. Capital flows, policy incentives, and market psychology aligned around a new assumption that crisis was no longer an exception, but a baseline condition. And in that environment, financial power concentrated where liquidity, trust, and enforcement converged. The war did not create this reality. It exposed it, accelerated it, and locked it more firmly into place. By the time the economic consequences of the war had fully propagated through markets, supply chains, and balance sheets, the central contradiction of the American position became impossible to ignore. On a macroeconomic level, the United States appeared resilient, adaptive, and strategically advantaged. Growth persisted where others stagnated. Capital flowed inward rather than outward, and institutional credibility remained intact. Yet beneath this aggregate performance lay a more fragile and uneven reality, one that exposed the limits of growth, driven by external instability rather than internal strength. For American households, the benefits of macro stability were indirect at best. While headline inflation eventually moderated, the cumulative effect of prolonged price increases permanently altered cost structures. Housing affordability deteriorated sharply as higher interest rates combined with years of underinvestment in supply. Mortgage costs rose faster than incomes, locking many households out of ownership and increasing dependence on rental markets already under strain. Food, healthcare, and insurance costs remained elevated, reflecting structural pressures that monetary policy alone could not resolve. Wage growth failed to keep pace with the new cost baseline. Nominal increases masked real stagnation, particularly for lower and middle income groups. The labor market remained tight in aggregate terms, but job security and quality diverged significantly across sectors. Industries tied to defense, energy, and finance offered stability and upward mobility, while service and consumer-facing sectors struggled with margin compression and labor turnover. The recovery, such as it was, favored alignment with geopolitical demand rather than domestic necessity. This divergence fed a deeper social imbalance. Asset holders benefited from rising equity valuations, stable bond markets, and sustained capital inflows. Those without significant financial exposure faced higher living costs without commensurate compensation. Wealth inequality widened not because of a single policy failure, but because the structure of growth privileged capital over labor. Financial resilience did not translate into social resilience. From a policy perspective, this created a false sense of security. As long as markets remained orderly and funding costs manageable, structural reform could be postponed. Infrastructure investments, productivity enhancement, and social cohesion initiatives remained secondary to crisis management and strategic positioning. External shocks absorbed political attention, allowing domestic inefficiencies to persist unresolved. The dependency created by this model became increasingly apparent. Growth was no longer primarily a function of innovation, productivity, or demographic expansion. It was increasingly tied to geopolitical fragmentation, energy insecurity elsewhere, and financial centralization at home. This dependence introduced a moral hazard at the systemic level. Stability became conditional on the continuation of stress beyond national borders. For global partners, the implications were equally complex. Allies absorbed higher energy costs, fiscal strain, and industrial erosion in exchange for security alignment. Emerging economies faced tighter financial conditions and reduced policy autonomy. While the United States did not engineer these outcomes unilaterally, it benefited disproportionately from them. This asymmetry strained alliances and fueled skepticism toward a system perceived as structurally biased. At the same time, efforts to build alternatives accelerated. Discussions around regional payment systems, currency diversification, and trade realignment intensified. Yet progress remained slow and fragmented. Trust, liquidity, and enforcement capacity could not be replicated overnight. In the interim, the existing system persisted, not because it was universally accepted, but because it remained functionally indispensable. Domestically, political tension mirrored economic imbalance. Public confidence in institutions weakened as lived experience diverged from official narratives of strength. Economic indicators pointed upward, while personal finances felt constrained. This disconnect fueled polarization and skepticism, complicating governance and long-term planning. An economy that appears strong but feels fragile carries latent instability of its own. From an investor's perspective, the picture was equally paradoxical. Returns were supported by policy credibility, capital inflows, and strategic advantage. Yet valuations increasingly depended on assumptions of continued instability and intervention. Risk was suppressed rather than eliminated. The longer this dynamic persisted, the greater the adjustment required to restore equilibrium. Markets priced continuity, not resolution. The long-term cost of this arrangement lies not in immediate collapse, but in erosion. Productivity growth remains modest. Infrastructure gaps widen. Social trust weakens. The system functions, but it does not renew itself. Each crisis reinforces the same patterns, deepening dependency while postponing transformation. By the end of this cycle, one conclusion becomes unavoidable. The war did not save the American economy. It stabilized it under conditions of stress by redirecting global imbalances inward. That stabilization bought time, not resolution. The structural challenges that preceded the conflict remain unresolved, now layered beneath new dependencies and expectations. The real risk ahead is not recession or market panic. It is normalization of fragility. An economy accustomed to functioning through external shocks gradually loses the capacity to grow without them. Stability becomes performative, maintained through intervention and advantage, rather than balance and productivity. In this sense, the ultimate cost of the war is not measured in deficits or inflation alone. It is measured in opportunity deferred and resilience postponed. The United States emerged from the conflict financially stronger in relative terms, but more dependent on a world that remains unstable. Whether this model can endure without undermining its own foundations remains the central, unanswered question. What is clear is this: macroeconomic victory does not guarantee societal prosperity. Financial dominance does not ensure internal cohesion. And an economy that learns to benefit from crisis must eventually confront the price of that dependence. The most dangerous illusion in economics is believing that survival equals strength. The United States did not collapse. It adapted. But adaptation through crisis is not the same as renewal. When growth depends on instability elsewhere, peace becomes economically inconvenient. When markets rely on intervention, risk does not disappear, it accumulates. And when financial dominance replaces productivity, the bill is only delayed. The real question is not whether this system works today. It clearly does. The question is whether an economy can remain stable when its advantages are built on global stress rather than internal balance. Because systems that learn to profit from crisis eventually forget how to grow without it. If you want to understand where the world economy is heading next, you must stop watching the headlines and start following the incentives. This was not the end of the story. It was the warning.